Good morning, or depending when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so I've made a podcast all about the Pokémon trading card game. And you're listening to PTCG Radio. Now, this week there's a couple of moderately interesting new cards, which I will be telling you lovely people about. I'm going to tell you a quick rant that's made me mad at Nintendo, and then we're going to look at speed decks. Now, speed decks are something, I know I've mentioned it in the YouTube videos from Nottingham Regionals. Bit of a shameless plug there. Go to YouTube and search PTCG Radio. You'll find it nice and easily. And we may have mentioned it once or twice on the pod, but I'm really going to get into speed decks today. We're going to talk about the ones that exist at the moment. We're going to talk about why they work. We're going to talk about the problems with them. And then we're going to get into the future of speed decks, looking at Roaring Skies, and looking at, what's going to happen to speed decks in the future. And spoiler alert, they're going to get worse. Hey-ho. But first, a couple of new cards to talk about. In fact, no, that's sort of a little bit of a rant. Just very, very quickly, on last week's podcast, I told you about the new Amiibos. And essentially what happened was that on Tuesday evening, I got an email from Nintendo saying, hey, Greninja and Jigglypuff Amiibos going up to pre-order on Wednesday at 3 in the afternoon. So at 1 minute past 3 in the afternoon, I went on and I pre-ordered my Greninja and Jigglypuff Amiibos, only to get an email the following day saying that too many were put up for pre-order and they're being given on a first-come, first-served basis, and that I was unfortunately too slow. Which struck me as odd because I had ordered them at 1 minute past 3. But it turns out that although the email said they'd release them at 3 o'clock, they just released them at 2:45 instead. And anyone who checked early, I could have, but I didn't because I was told 3 o'clock, has now got them, and if you didn't order before the stated time, you didn't get them. Which is utterly ludicrous and a brilliant way to treat your fans. Cheers, Nintendo. And as someone who has run a weekly podcast about Pokemon for 3 years, I think I've got a bit of a right to feel a little bit aggrieved about this, especially given that, going by recent Amiibos, I will now never have a chance to, get the Greninja Amiibo for a decent amount of money. Certainly I've never been able to get the Fire Emblem or, the King DDD Amiibos, which frustrates me massively. If anyone knows where I can get a Greninja Amiibo, do let me know. But, not for like 40 or 50 quid. But if you find somewhere that will let me pre-order it, please tweet me at the Wassy. I'd very much appreciate that. And of course, needless to say, I will not be doing any shameless promotion for Nintendo's Amiibos in the future. They can go do one, quite frankly. So, cheers, Nintendo. Moving on to happier news, we have seen a couple of new cards, and they're both moderately interesting, but I fear ultimately fruitless. So starting off, and these are cards which are being given out in, one of them is being given out in the newest issue of Pokémon Fan Magazine Pokemon Fan Magazine revealed that they're going to be in July's Gym Challenge promos in Japan. Now this is, as I've told you, in Japan they've got these Gym Challenge series, and essentially you can go along to them and you get promo cards if you enter, nice and simple. And one of these is going to be a Jirachi, and the Jirachi's interesting. It's got 2 attacks, but the second one's rubbish. So let's start off with the only one we're worried about. For a colourless energy, you get to discard a special energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon, and then if you do that, you can prevent all effects of attacks, including damage, done to this Pokemon by attacks during your opponent's next turn. Now remember that something like Seismitoad's Quaking Punch and the associated Trainer Lock is not an effect done to the Pokemon, it's an effect done to the player. So it wouldn't stop something like Trainer Lock, otherwise this would be a really, really good Seismitoad counter. But it will stop things like Poison, Confusion, Burn, Sleep, all that kind of stuff. It's interesting because essentially it can allow you to buy a turn. You can have a Pokemon which is essentially immune to attacks up there at, for a turn, while you set up behind him. It could be used as instead of something like Rovo Substitute in a Don fan deck, although you would have to attach an energy to Jirachi to use him. Biggest problem with Jirachi, of course, is the fact that the most useful for this will be an awesome Seismitoad counter, because a lot of Seismitoad decks just play DCE. So you could use Jirachi and essentially sit there, get rid of the DCE, and then be immune to damage the following turn. You'd still be trainer locked, but your opponent wouldn't be able to do any damage. Sooner or later, they wouldn't be able to hit a DCE, and you're off and rolling because you're not trainer locked anymore. Problem is, of course, that Seismitoad decks are just going to laser you. Post-rotation, assuming there's a rotation after Worlds, for newer players, newer listeners, essentially after Worlds they rotate, and what that means is that Pokemon, they denote a new starting block, and only sets from then on be legal in tournaments. So at the moment we're playing Boundaries Crossed On, so after Worlds last year we rotated to Boundaries Crossed On. And the likelihood is that after Worlds this year we'll see a similar kind of rotation, so sets like Boundaries Crossed in the next couple will no longer be legal, and there'll be a newer starting set from which it will be legal. Now we can assume Seismitoad's going to be legal because Furious Fist. Maybe Hypnotoxic Laser gets rotated out, maybe it doesn't. In a format with no Hypnotoxic Laser but Seismitoad, Seismitoad becomes instantly a lot less powerful due to a lack of Hypnotoxic Laser, and in such a scenario this Jirachi could be potentially very, very useful as a Seismitoad counter, because you could get rid of the DCE, they're not lasering you, they're not doing any damage, they run out of DCEs, and off we go. Biggest problem, of course, with this is that if Seismitoad loses laser, it's not going to need to be countered quite so much. Although plenty more Seismitoad to come in this podcast. And yes, I know I talk about Seismitoad a lot, and we talk about Seismitoad every week, but something that must be borne in mind with the particular format at the moment is we're in a Seismitoad heavy format, so I hate to break it to you, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm going to be talking about Seismitoad for a little while to come yet. Kind of like Blastoise was for many, many months, or Darkrai. The other card which has been released is Tyrantrum EX. Now, I like Tyrantrum. He's in my little party that I'm currently going through Pokemon Y with. Yeah, I haven't quite finished Pokemon Y yet. Please don't judge me. But in my defense, I've been playing games like Fire Emblem and Xenoblade Chronicles. So what am I supposed to do? Those games rock. But I am going through Pokemon Y quite slowly. I've got a Tyrantrum. So, is this card any good? And kind of is the answer. It's an intriguing EX. It's got an ability, Tyrant Fang. Damage from this Pokemon's attacks isn't affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. Now, just to get it out of the way before anyone starts asking, this does not involve weakness and resistance. Weakness and resistance are not effects on your opponent's active Pokemon, they are gameplay mechanics, so let's get that out of the way straight away. But something like abilities like Safeguard from Suicune or Sigilif, these would be effects on the defending Pokemon, so this would go right through them. Things like Jirachi, if your opponent used Jirachi to discard an energy, there will then be an effect on the Jirachi which stops damage being done, but Tyrantrum would then go right through that. So anything that stopped you attacking or lowered the attack from something like an attack or an ability or something like that, Tyrantrum would go straight through. So already it's not an amazing ability, but it's useful and it's going to have a little bit of an impact. The question is, of course, is this card actually going to be good enough to play? It's got one attack and it's interesting. Fighting, Metal, Colourless, Dragon Impact. 190 damage, discard free energy attached to this Pokemon. It's essentially Dialga. Now, Dialga for 2 metal and a double colourless, attacks for 150, and you hope to have a muscle band to do 170. Tyrantrum is, now it's got a different weakness, Fairy not Fire, and Fairy decks are still semi-relevant, so maybe it's got a worse weakness, but other than that, Tyrantrum is a better Dialga. And there's, essentially, because it does 40 more damage. Now, it discards 3, not 2, but if your deck's up and running, it's really not a big issue. The way Dialga generally works is you get Bronzong set up on the bench that you use to attach metal energy to your bench Dialga. You then attach a double colourless and hit for 150. Now, Tyrantrum is fighting metal colourless, but one thing that must be borne in mind is that double dragon energy, which will function here in the exact same way as double colourless does for a Dialga deck, will just provide the fighting energy. So you don't need to play any fighting energy, you just play this as if it were a Dialga. Trying to play it in a non-Bronzong deck will be very, very awkward. If it was fighting metal colourless, and you could use double colourless and double dragon, it would be very susceptible to enhanced hammer, but you could essentially be using this for 2 energy attachments. Of course, you would not be able to discard 3 energy without discarding all 4 energy, so it would be awkward, but there's a chance here. Now, there's all the kind of general things you could do here. You could potentially use this with a Landorus and double dragon energy. The theory being that the fighting and colourless can be used with fighting energy, and then it's a dragon, by the way, not a fighting. So strong energy you couldn't be using. But you could use this with regular Landorus. So, you use regular Landorus to attach fighting energy from the discard pile, and then use double dragon energy to provide the 2 metal for the attack cost. You could use Jirachi, again just attaching fighting energy and using double dragon as the metal, or indeed just attaching metal energy and using the double dragon as either the fighting or the metal as appropriate. But I don't really like Jirachi because it's so weak, and when we started talking about Groudon, people thought Victini could be a good way to play Groudon, and as the results of these tournaments have shown, the stakes we've been looking at over the past few weeks, it's generally not worked. So I think you could play it with Landorus, but the best way here is to play it with Bronzong. And as I said, there are 2 major advantages to playing this over Dialga. Number 1, it does more damage. It does 190. Even with a muscle band, Dialga only did 170. So those pesky 180 HP EXs, like for instance Seismitoad, would hurt you because you couldn't knock it out in one hit. The other huge advantage is that you save spaces in the deck. So not only are you doing 190, but you now don't have to run Muscle Band. So rather than running 3 or 4 Muscle Bands, you've now just got 3 or 4 extra spaces in the deck. And you literally could take a metal deck and just literally take out double colourless energy and replace it with double dragon energy, take out Dialga and replace it with Tyrantrum, and you could have the exact same deck working in the exact same way, but you wouldn't need a muscle band, and you'd be able to one-hit KO 180 HP Pokemon. Big downside here, of course, it's susceptible to Enhanced Hammer, although if you play it right, you can just put Double Dragon down and then immediately discard it with the attack. The biggest problem is you've got to get the Bronzong set up. Metal hasn't been storming the tournament scene. It's been doing okay here and there, but it's not really been a powerhouse deck. Tyrantrum, I don't know if it's going to make a huge difference. What I will say, however, is adding in 3 or 4 slots to a deck can often be huge. How many, I'm assuming people listening to this play Pokemon. There are some exceptions, but we're assuming that happens, and of course assuming that we've all been playing Pokemon for a little while and we build our own decks and we don't net deck. You all understand, or you will understand, I should say, you should understand, that in every deck, you just want 2 or 3 more spaces for 2 or 3 more cards. Well, if you play your Dialga deck with Tyrantrum instead of Dialga, now you've got those cards to use. I'm going to make them play this deck purely because I like Tyrantrum as a Pokemon. I don't think it's going to be amazing. I don't think those extra free spaces are going to be good enough. But maybe I use those extra free spaces for Robo Substitute, and that buys me the extra turn or 2 I need to set up the Bronzong with Tyrantrum, and maybe that allows me to actually get this deck set up consistently. I don't know, but it's something that interests me. Plus, it's a dragon, not a fighting, which is good because it means it won't be resisted by Rayquaza EX, but of course Rayquaza decks are always going to be mega. So they're the 2 new cards. I like Tyrantrum, and I want to like it more than I do. I do like it a little bit, but I just fear it's not going to be quite good enough, unfortunately. But hey-ho, these things happen. There's nothing really we can do about it. Now, the main thing I want to talk about today is speed decks. So, to give you a little bit of background, we have speed decks now, and we have proper speed decks. Now, going way back, one of I've always liked to play slightly unusual decks, shall we say. And the first really good deck that I built myself, I played around with Umbreon Prime Tyranitar Prime for a little while. There wasn't even a Prime the Umbreon, although I did play the Prime in the deck. It was the Umbreon with Moonlight Fang, which stopped Pokemon with Poke Powers and Poke Bodies, what would now be abilities, and Tyranitar Prime. This was not a great deck, but I top-4'd some Battle Roads, what League Challenges are now. What League Challenges used to be, essentially, with that deck. And I did all right here and there. But the first real good deck I made was a Donphan deck, and it was a complete speed Donphan deck. Now, Donphan Prime had an attack for 1 fighting energy, which did 60 damage, and there was a card at the time called Expert Bout. You attached it to your Pokemon, it gave you 20 HP more, it allowed you to do 20 more damage per attack, but it turned it essentially into an EX. You'd give up 2 prizes if it was knocked out. But of course, this meant you could be doing 80 damage for 1 energy with Donphan. He also had a Pokebody like Bouffalont, or Samurott had a little while ago, whereby all attacks done to you were reduced by 20. So essentially, you'd sit there with Donphan, tanking a little bit, hitting 480 damage with Expert Bout. Back then, we had Rare Candy, which worked on stage 1s as well for a little while, i.e., and you could use it on the first turn of the game. So turn 1, you could Rare Candy a Phanpy into a Donphan, which will sound very weird for people that weren't playing back then. But more so than that, we had a card called Broken Time Space, and this was a stadium card which, as all stadiums, affected both players, and it essentially allowed you to evolve whenever the hell you felt like it. So the point of the deck for me was very, very simple. I'd put a Phanpy down, I would immediately evolve it into a Donphan, attach a Fighting Energy and an Expert Bout, and I would hit 80 damage, and I would hit 80 damage on turn 1. Probably about 75%, 80% of my games I'd be hitting 80 damage on turn 1. And about 90% of the time I'd be hitting the turn 1 Donphan without an Expert Bout. And there were plenty of cards that allowed me to do this back then. I wouldn't play Claydol because that was a bit too clunky. But we had Uxie, which was a card, it was a basic Pokemon. You played it on your bench and it allowed you to draw until you had 7 cards in your hand. There was a card called Unknown R, which you would put on your bench and then you would essentially discard it without giving up a prize and you would draw a card. And you could play 4 of what was called Pokédraw Plus. If you played Pokédraw Plus, you were allowed to draw a card. But if you saved it in your hand and were able to play 2 of them at the same time, you were allowed to search your card for any 2 cards, like Teammates. It was an amazing deck because it went really, 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 really fast. Between Unknown R, Pokédraw Plus, and Uxie, I would legitimately draw through, half my deck on turn 1 of the game. Oh, we also had Pokemon Collector back then, which allowed us to search for free basic Pokemon. So I could literally, use my supporter for the turn to grab a Phanpy and a pair of Uxies, or, Unknown R's, or whatever, and just, play my hand out, play an Uxie, play my hand out, play an Uxie. While I'm playing my hand out, I'm playing these Pokédraw Pluses and Unknown R's and all of that. It was super, super fast. Now, that was just a little bit of nostalgia history lesson. If anyone's interested, I won a couple of league challenges with... No, I didn't. I went to 3 battle roads with it, getting 1st, 2nd and 3rd. I then got top 16 at UK Nationals with the deck. The only time I've actually top cut UK Nationals. And I use that as an example because what happened after, we're having a bit of a history lesson, I suppose. Because after that, we lost Uxie. We also lost Claydol. Now, Claydol was a stage 1, which allowed you to put 1 or 2 cards on the bottom of your deck, and then draw 2, you had 6 in your hand. And if you had 2 or 3 on the bench, you could do that 3 or 4 times a game. Remembering that we had Broken Time Space in the format, so you could get Claydol out on the first turn of the game. You see where we're going with this. Although back then there were no trainers on turn 1, so you wanted to go second. Now, in this situation, we lost Uxie, we lost Claydol, we lost Unknown R, we lost Pokédraw Plus, and then we ended up in a much slower format. And then they took away the turn 1 attacking, and they nerfed Rare Candy, and the format slowed down quite a bit. It never slowed down properly. We've always had a fast format, and we've ended up in situations where we've had donks going around with Landorus and all of that. But we've not, for a little while now, had decks where we could, run through our deck in a turn or 2. And that's what I'm talking about with speed decks. I'm talking about decks where we are legitimately running through our deck in 2 or 3 turns. Now, we've been gradually going more towards this, and there's been a few cards that have helped. First of all, the bike cards. Bicycle, Acrobike, Roller Skates. Roller Skates, flip a coin if heads, draw 3 cards. Acrobike, look at the top 2 cards, take 1, discard 1. And Bicycle, draw until you've got 4 cards in your hand. And the reason these are relevant is because they are trainer draw, so you can use these while using your supporter. We've always still been a little bit disadvantaged because we've been, we've been running out of essentially good trainer draw. You're not going to be drawing a huge amount of cards every turn, but if you combine a Juniper with a couple of bikes and Acrobikes and Roller Skates, you can still get through your deck in 2 or 3 turns. Now, there was a deck, there were decks like Speed Uxie, which would legitimately run through the entire deck in 1 turn. I haven't really got time to explain that here, but go and look up Speed Uxie decks. They could literally, and I think Jay Witz did a lovely video about this. If I can remember, I might tweet it out if I can find it. But he basically did a video where he demonstrated how a Speed Uxie deck could run through its entire deck in a single turn. So you would go first, or second, sorry, and then you would just, even if your opponent had like 4 Pokemon on the field, you could donk them with 4 Pokemon on the field. It was an amazing sight to behold, so I encourage you all to look that up. But anyway, so now we're getting back into this, and the other card which has really been helpful has been Lissandra's Trump card. Because, of course, when you run through your deck, what you then need to do is put all your cards in and start again to stop yourself decking out. But what we've lacked is something like Uxie or Claydol. We've had ones that allow you to draw a card, and the only one of that that's really been successful is Slurpuff. Now, just as a side note here, before I get into speed decks properly, I'm not really going to be talking about Seismitoad Slurpuff as a speed deck, because that's not really what it is. Because it tends to play less supporters and it can get slower starts, but when it gets up and running, then it runs brilliantly and it gets very, very fast. But Seismitoad Slurpuff can be a very, very slow deck for the first few turns. Check out the final of Nottingham Regionals on my YouTube channel, shameless plug, and you'll see that in one of the games, Alex Dow went down by several prizes, and I'm not going to tell you if he won the game or not, but he at least made a decent comeback. And that's very, very important because it can have a bit of a slower start. The speed decks I'm talking about are, we are setting up on turn 2 every game, but that we're kind of one-trick ponies. So the 3 examples I'm going to use for today, or 4 examples let's say, are Donphan, Executor, Manectric and Flareon. I am not for a second saying they are the only speed decks around, but they are the successful speed decks. Now, looking at Donphan, Executor, and Manectric, I've seen these running around very similar engines, and the theory is you use your trainer draw, you run through the deck, you trump back in, you're done. Donphan is a stage 1, Executor is a stage 1, and Manectric really benefits from having 2 energy on, although can attack for 1 energy just fine, so none of these are turn 1 decks. And it is important here to distinguish between the speed decks here and the speed decks I mentioned from 2011, like my Speed Donphan deck from back there. And yes, I love that Speed Donphan is a thing. That's why I've played it at the last regional I went to. Because the key here is that you still need to lose a turn. Having said that, if you go first, you can't attack anyway, so maybe it's not the end of the world. But Donphan attacks for a single energy, Executor attacks for a single energy, Manectric attacks for a single energy, and then, perpetuates itself by attaching to the bench. Flareon attacks for a single energy because the main attacker is Flareon, double colourless, but you've also got Leafeon, 1 colourless energy, and you've got Empoleon, 1 water energy in order to get going. Flareon and Leafeon are again stage 1s, but Empoleon can actually get going on the first turn of the game, using Archie's Ace in the Hole. Now, you do need to have an Archie you need to get a Empoleon in a discard pile, and then you need to have an Archie as the only card in your deck, but if you can do that, you play the Archie, the Empoleon goes on your bench as if it was a basic Pokemon, you draw 5 cards, and you're up and running. So all of these I would classify as speed decks. They get going very, very quickly, and they keep going. But the thing that you generally find about speed decks is they tend to be one-trick ponies. Because if you counter them, you counter them. Now, one of the reasons why Donphan remains my favourite deck I've ever played is because there were other cards back then. There were cards like Regirock that allowed you to discard a couple of cards and attach a fighting energy to your bench Donphan, allowing you to use a second attack, which did 90 for free energy. I also played Regice, which allowed you to discard a couple of cards, and then you could force your opponent to switch their active Pokemon. Now, this was important at the time because the main trainer lock back then was Vileplume. A stage 2, you get it on the bench, both people are trainer locked. But Spiritomb had active trainer lock as a basic. As soon as it was in the active, your opponent was trainer locked. And it even had an attack which allowed you to evolve one of your bench Pokemon. Just search through and evolve, search through your deck and evolve it. So people would start off by putting Spiritomb out there, and then they would train lock you with Spiritomb while they built up Vileplume, and then you'd be train locked from the very first turn till the end. So Regice was in there to switch your opponent's active. Now, I'm not trying to make out I was some kind of master deck builder. What I'm showing you was that back then the decks were so fast and so consistent. I played 1 Regirock, I played 1 Regice. And the reason was that, as I say, I ran through my deck so quickly, I could afford to run these cards as one-offs. and this helped me greatly. These current speed decks we're seeing are not the same. Now, hopefully I'm going to start, I haven't managed to get the footage yet, but hopefully I'm going to be putting the Yeovil Regionals up soon, and you'll see my top 8 game from Yeovil Regionals with my Donphan deck, and the only real trick I'm playing is Pokemon Catcher. Because in order for these decks to run now, because we don't have the same kind of tricks we had before, we do have to rely on, really straightforward, consistent lists. But you don't just rely on speed. And all of the decks that I've mentioned as speed decks, they have something else. So let's go through them. Donphan denies prizes. Through Focus Sash, through Life Dew, and through Robo Substitute, yes, Donphan gets going early, but Donphan is not a particularly powerful deck. It does 40 damage per turn. Now this increases as you add in your strong energy and your muscle band and your fighting stadium, but you're still doing 40 energy per turn. But what Donphan does is it denies prizes. It stops your opponent essentially ever taking prizes. And that means that it's got something else. It gets going fast, but the thing you don't want in a speed deck is you don't want to be going and then, your opponent's set up, you lose. You want to be going faster than your opponent, but you are rarely going to have a speed deck which is better than your opponent's deck. You get set up faster, but your attacks are a little bit weaker, but that's okay, you've got something else. Manectric self-perpetuates. What I mean by that is Manectric does 110 damage per turn, but it's got free retreat, and it attaches 2 energy to the bench Pokemon. So you use one Mega Manectric to set up the next Mega Manectric, and so on and so forth, and you use Rough Seas to heal. So you've got Self-Perpetuation, you've got Prize Denial, now we're rolling. Executor, again, it does 30 damage per turn, but it supporter locks your opponent, so you can play things like Crushing Hammer and Laser, while your opponent is supporter locked, and completely lock them out of the game. Flareon hasn't got anything this explicit, but Flareon has got a little bag of tricks. It's got the Empoleon, the Leafeon, the Flareon, it's got type coverage, and you'll notice that with the exception of Manectric, which heals with Rough Seas and self-perpetuates, they're all single prize Pokemon, because again, if you're playing a speed deck, what you don't want to be doing is, my opponent's set up, now they're running through my EXs and I'm losing. So the way we play speed decks now is very different to the way they used to be played. We're relying on trainer draw, not Pokemon draw. We're relying on weaker attacks, but we've got some other little trick to run us through. Now, the big counter to speed decks at the moment is Seismitoad, and I'll make this very, very simple. We don't have Pokemon draw, we have trainer draw. In order to run a successful speed deck at the moment, you need trainer draw, and that is what Seismitoad stops. Seismitoad kills speed decks. Again, I don't count Seismitoad Slurpuff as a speed deck, because in order for Seismitoad Slurpuff to fit in all the tricks it needs, its hammers and lasers and all of that, it generally plays 4 double colourless energy and no others, as well as playing a lower count of supporters. When it sets up, it keeps going and can lock you out the game and do good comebacks, but it's not, outside of a good draw, a hugely consistent deck. And honestly, if you think you've got a Seismitoad Slurpuff deck which is very, very consistent, then you must have cut down on some of the tricks. You're playing less hammers, less lasers, less super scoop up, etc. There is not enough space in the deck to make a super consistent from turn 1 Seismitoad Slurpuff list while playing all the tricks. You've got to compromise. In the UK, the general way people have been playing it is, I'm going to accept that I might have an ever so slightly slower start. I might get the lock on turn 3 or 4 rather than on turn 1. But when I get the lock, I'm drawing so many cards with Slurpuff, combined with me Super Scoop Ups, Lasers, Hammers, that it really doesn't matter if I've lost a Toad and a Swirlix and I'm 3 prizes down. When I get set up, you're locked out of the game. Now, there are exceptions to these two. It's not just Speed Deck versus Seismitoad. The two major exceptions are Virizion Genesect and Evil Town. Now, Virizion Genesect is very, very easy. You need 2 attachments on Virizion. There's no point running a particular speed deck. Virizion Genesect has long been the most consistent deck in the format. You need a Virizion, a Genesect, 2 Grass Energy, and it's been hyper consistent pretty much since it came out. The reason why you run all of these ridiculous speed cards and try and make the fastest deck you can is to ensure that you get set up at the earliest opportunity. you're getting the turn 2 Emerald Slash with Virgin 90% of the time if you've got a decent list, maybe more. You don't need the speed cards. We don't run the speed cards. Now, the weird one is Evil Tau, because you could run a speed Evil Tau deck. Yes, you need 2 energy attachments, but Manectric kind of does. And Donphan to stage 1, as is Executor, as is Flareon. So there's nothing really which tells me that I can't be running a really fast Evil Tau deck. But there's a very good reason people aren't. That's not the best way to play Evil Tau. Evil Tau, you pop in Garbodor, Darkrai, Seismitoad, whatever, and the really good players, and you'll see this again, sorry, another shameless plug, I'll try and stop. In my Nottingham Regionals videos, go and look at Ryan Morehouse, any of the decks, games he's played, or even Matthew King for that matter, and you'll see that these decks give people options, and you lose the options that makes Evil Tau so powerful if you try running a speed deck. So essentially here, we've got a bunch of speed decks which are doing okay, but they're largely blacked out by Seismitoad. That sucks. There are some exceptions which are neither Seismitoad nor speed deck, so we've actually got quite a nice balanced format. So the big question now becomes, as I've given you a little bit of historical data, and I've run you through the state of speed decks at the moment, what's going to be happening to speed decks in the future? I should also mention, one thing I should have said, VS Seeker has also massively helped speed decks, because if you want to be running really, really fast and running through your deck, you want to be playing a Professor Juniper every turn, because this is the most aggressive, fastest supporter we have. You can only put 4 in your deck, so a lot of these speed decks, like my Donphan deck, like a lot of the Executor decks I've seen, the supporter line will be essentially 4 Random Receiver, 4 Juniper, 4 VS Seeker, which allows you to run through your deck very quickly. So going into Roaring Skies, the new set, there are basically 3 cards, and we're going to ignore Rayquaza for the minute, we'll get on to him. But for speed decks in general, there are 3 cards which really, really help. And they are Shaymin, Wily, and Mega Turbo. Shaymin is basically just a reprint of Uxie. Now you get 1 less card, you draw till 6 in the hand, not 7, and it's an EX which gives up 2 prizes, which gives a risk-reward thing going on, but honestly, it's still, it's very, very, very similar. Now, hopefully I explained to you sufficiently why Pokemon Draw, or the lack thereof, has been holding speed decks back. It's part of why I gave you the historical background using my Speed Donphan deck as an example. Pokemon Draw and the lack thereof of good Pokemon Draw has held speed decks back. That's not a problem anymore. Shaymin will be a 1 or 2 of in every deck, and a lot of decks will play 3 or 4. Shaymin will be used. It will make decks faster. You could now legitimately, through a combination of roller skates and acrobike and bicycle and Shaymin, you could run a deck with no draw supporters at all. Now, I don't recommend you do. Speed decks will still probably want 4 Juniper and a couple VS Seeker, but you wouldn't need a random receiver anymore, and you could certainly just get away with playing Juniper. So I don't need to say much more about Shaymin. I've explained it with Uxie. We've even got that supporter, I forget the name right now, but it allows you to search for free Pokemon which are colourless. So you can search for free Shaymin and just go for it. Just be going Shaymin after Shaymin. Empty your deck, empty your hand, draw the 6. Empty your hand, draw the 6. And yes, okay, it would be, you'd have a couple of Shaymin in your hand initially, but hopefully you get the point there. So it's going to make the deck much, much faster. Mega Turbo only works for Mega Pokemon or Mega EXs, but it's still incredibly useful. What it essentially does is it allows you to attach an extra energy to your Mega EX. Now, that really, really helps with something like, let's say Mega Rayquaza. No, we're not there yet. Mega Manectric. Now you don't need 2 energy, you need 1 energy and a Mega Turbo. Now we're talking. Now we've added a little bit of speed. We've increased the chances we're getting it done on turn 2. The other card which is really going to help is Wally, which I am going to occasionally pronounce in the annoying movie way, but I'll try and keep it to a minimum. And the thing about Wally is that it's a supporter that can be used on turn 1 to evolve into a stage 1. Now we have a stage 1 Flareon, a stage 1 Leafeon, a stage 1 Donphan, a stage 1 Executor. If your opponent goes second, you have your very first turn of the game with supporters, and that is the only supporter you'll ever play. because then Executor comes out on turn 2, your supporter locked for the game. Less of an issue, to be honest, with Shaman in the format, because the better non-supporter draw we have, the less supporters you need. The weird thing is, looking back, and I don't have my Speed Donphan deck to hand, but I didn't play that many draw supporters. I didn't need to play many draw supporters. My deck was consistent without it. Can't remember exactly what I played. Maybe a couple of Professor Oak's New Theory, but I didn't play many draw supporters at all. We're not there yet. We still don't quite have the speed deckiness that we had back in 2011, but we're getting back towards there. So now, if you've got a stage 1 like Donphan or Executor that attacks for a single energy, you no longer have to wait till turn 2. And using Wally as your supporter for the turn becomes a heck of a lot less daunting and frustrating, because it doesn't draw you cards, it just evolves. But that becomes a hell of a lot less of a problem when you've got Shaman and all to be able to draw cards. It really is incredibly useful. So, yeah, quite frankly at the moment, that's all pretty good. So, suppose we'd better get to Rayquaza. I am very interested to see what happens around Nationals, and I'm still hoping that at some point in the future I'm going to have an interesting announcement about that, but I'm afraid I can't tell you until it's properly confirmed, and it's not properly confirmed yet, so, maybe you can try and guess. Otherwise, hopefully I'll be able to tell you next week, but I need to get in touch with somebody before I can spill the beans. Plus, I'm not saying it on the podcast. If it doesn't end up happening, I'll just look like a moron. But Nationals to me is going to be very interesting. Nationals is going to be shortly after release of Roaring Skies, the release, and we're not going to be able to have a huge amount of results from which we can draw when we're looking at how good or not it's going to be. But let's go through Rayquaza then. And I'm probably going to forget something. There's so much that helps it. But let's see what I can remember. So, starting off then, we have the fact that it's got an attack which allows you to do 30 damage times the amount of bench Pokemon you have. Okay, that's only 150. Hang on a second. It's not the amount of bench Pokemon you have because, of course, we've got the Stadium. And the Stadium allows you to have 8 bench Pokemon. The Stadium's called Skyfield. Now you can do 240 damage. Well, that's okay, you need free energy. But you don't need free energy. You need a double colourless energy. And let's not forget Mega Turbo. You get a basic energy in your discard pile, attach it with Mega Turbo. You have attached all free energy in one turn. So you've got this EX, this Mega EX, which can potentially do 240 damage because of the Stadium. You need free energy, and you can attach them all in one turn. But you have to lose your turn when you Mega Evolve. Well, no you don't, because we've got a Spirit Link. As a side note, something else which has helped Mega EX speed decks. Okay, but you still can't evolve on the first turn of the game, but you can with Delta Evolution. That means that Mega Rayquaza can evolve on turn 1 of the game. So, or the turn you put it down. So now we've got an EX that can Mega Evolve on turn 1 of the game. It's got a Spirit Link, so you don't need to end your turn to do so. And it attacks for free energy, all of which you can get going in one turn. Now it's starting to look a little bit scary. Because now we can get going, and hopefully I've just explained how, we can get this Mega EX going on turn 1 of the game, hitting for up to 240, or turn 2 if you're going first. Now, okay, but in order to do that, you need Rayquaza, you need Mega Rayquaza, you need the Spirit Link, you need the double colourless, you need the energy in the discard and the Mega Turbo, and you need Skyfield and a whole bunch of bench Pokemon. That is a lot to draw on the first turn of the game. Well, we have Shaman now. And Shaman allows us to draw until we got 6 cards in our hand. This helps us massively. Now, the supporter I forgot the name to a moment ago is called Winona. It allows you to search for free colourless Pokemon. Now, let's remember, ladies and gentlemen, Rayquaza is a colourless Pokemon. Rayquaza EX. Mega Rayquaza EX is a colourless Pokemon. Shaman EX is a colourless Pokemon. So I could legitimately say I start with a Rayquaza, I can search for a Mega Rayquaza and 2 Shaman, and I can keep the Mega Rayquaza in my hand until I draw a Spirit Link. Now we're getting somewhere. Now it's starting to look pretty good. One thing that other people have pointed out, you can use Execute in this deck, and it potentially can get donked on turn 1 of the game, like for instance by Latios or Latias. One of them's got an attack for 1 energy which can be used even if you go first and does 40 damage. So do be careful, because that can donk and Execute on the very first turn of the game. It's Latios. 40 damage for 1 psychic energy can be used on the first turn of the game even if you go first, and it will donk and Execute. So, something to bear in mind if you start putting your deck full of Executes. But the thing about Execute, of course, you put a Sky field down, and then you can just grab the Executes off your bench, off your discard, and you can put them onto your bench. Although do look out for things like Bat decks, which ironically could just run through all of them while they're on your bench and help you quite a lot. Now, this is all looking very, very good, because now we've got a supporter that allows you to search for everything you need, a Pokemon that can hit for 240 on the first turn of the game, it can evolve on the first turn, you don't lose your turn, it runs off a double colourless energy, and the third energy can be attached from the discard. This, ladies and gentlemen, could be a game-breaking deck if somebody can make a list that runs consistently. Biggest problem is it's weak to lightning, so people can abuse this by running Manectric, but we've got Altaria, which gets rid of the lightning weakness. And as if that wasn't enough, that's got Delta Evolution as well. So you can evolve that on turn 1 of the game, even if you go first, so your Rayquazas never have a weakness. So now you've got a Mega EX, which can hit for up to 240 damage, that you can get going in 1 turn, that has 220 HP, and no weakness. That is utterly ridiculous. And I know I've mentioned this deck a few times, but as we're talking about speed decks, this is a natural kind of conclusion to our discussion. We start off with old speed decks, talk about why they went away, talk about why they're coming back, and talk about the future. And the natural conclusion, the future, is Mega Rayquaza EX. Now, the biggest problem here is it's got a real natural counter in that it would get utterly destroyed by a very good speed Manectric deck, because of course the Shaman is also weak to lightning. Problem is, Shaman also gets granted immunity from weakness by Altaria. Oh yeah, and Altaria is a stage 1, so you can't turn off the ability with Silent Lab. You can with Wobbuffet if it's active, but then if it's active, you're not hitting with a lightning Pokemon. If you're hitting with a lightning Pokemon, it's not active, so that's irrelevant. You'd need a Garbodor to turn this off. So I'm interested about Mega Rayquaza EX. Whether people are going to be able to make a deck which can go through their deck fast enough and can get set up in 1 turn, hitting for, we don't need 240, you need 180. So, you can get 6 bench Pokemon on the bench. I don't know is the honest answer. But it's going to be very interesting to see if people can, because proper speed decks could be coming back. You add in the Delta Revolution, the Shaman, the Spirit Link. The Delta Revolution is basically broken time space. The Shaman is basically Uxie. And we've got Pokemon Collector back in the guise of Winona. This could potentially turn into a game-breaking deck. But of course, there's always things to counter it. First in line, Seismitoad. Then Seismitoad can play Garbodor. Now, although Silent Lab doesn't counter Altaria, it does counter Shaman. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is very, very important. Because it means that your opponent could potentially, if they're playing Shaman as their main draw, they could be screwed over. Now, they'll be playing their own Skyfield to counter your Silent Lab, but they have to get the Skyfield out. So, you play Seismitoad, you put a couple of Silent Lab in there, just to buy time until you've got your Garbodor up and running, and then you replace it with a Verbank City Gym. And we can easily beat Rayquaza. Because you're running Enhanced Hammer to get rid of their double colourless. They can't play Mega Turbo. And they can't play Spirit Link. And they're not going to get free energy going in 1 turn without Mega Turbo, so they're going to need the double colourless, which you can get rid of with Enhanced Hammer. And you can use Silent Lab to kill their Shaman. And then you can use your Garbodor to make sure the Shaman doesn't come out again. And let's not forget, of course, that they can't use a... they can't use something along the lines of a Startling Megaphone to turn Garbodor off. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we're starting to roll. Now, this is going to be available in Nationals. Whether we lose Hypnotoxic Laser after the rotation, I don't know. Go back over the last few years of the podcast and you will notice that every time a rotation happens, I go to a great deal of effort to look through exactly what we're losing in the rotation, which decks are going to be affected. I think I did a two-parter last year because there was so much of it. But if and when the rotation happens, I'll go through all of the cards we're losing. I will tell you the decks that get stronger, the decks that get weaker. I'll go through all of it. Let's not worry about the rotation now. Don't worry your pretty little heads about it. What I do want to worry about is Rayquaza. And honestly, Seismitoad looks like a pretty good counter. The thing about Rayquaza is it has everything its own way. You turn off Shaman, you stop Mega Turbo, you stop the Spirit Link, you get rid of their energy. It's looking pretty good. Now, don't get me wrong. If they have some ludicrous start, let's say they go second and get completely set up in one turn because you can't train lock them going first, and then they knock out your Seismitoad, maybe. But even then, you can get rid of their energy and laser them, and off we go. So, I don't know. It's going to be interesting, shall we say. By the way, if they go first on the first turn of the game, they can't attack, and then you can get rid of their energy. So, it kind of helps. Not to mention, of course, that, they're going to have Shamans that you can Lysandre up and laser, and they're going to have, potentially executes on the bench and all of that. So they can be easily killed by something like a Landorus or something along those lines. So speed decks have been evolving, and they're going to continue to get better. And Rayquaza, with all the little tricks, and I think they've gone a little bit overboard on this set with Rayquaza. I'm going to be honest, that's a bit too much for one deck. Hey-ho, they're doing it. It's going to be interesting, but like I say, we've got Seismitoad, and the interesting thing for me is that Seismitoad is a counter to the speed decks at the moment, and as soon as you go and get out a Rayquaza EX deck, Seismitoad looks like a pretty good counter again. So, I suppose we shall wait and see what happens. Hopefully this has been interesting. Hopefully it's taught you a little bit about the past, present and future of speed decks, or at least got you thinking about them a little bit more. We will be back with more Pokemon-y good stuff next week. As always, if you want to tweet at me, you can find me on Twitter at @TheWassy, and if you're not following that by now, you really should be. You can email me at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk. More people have been emailing me recently since I started reading a few out on the podcast. I love that. Please keep emailing me. Thank you to all the people that have. Maybe I'll read a few more out next week if I get a few minutes to do so. And you can find my YouTube channel by Googling PTCG Radio YouTube or just searching PTCG Radio on YouTube. The entirety of Nottingham Regionals is up there at the moment, and I'm hoping if I can get the footage, Yeovil Regionals will be joining it soon. Although do bear in mind that I am an A-level teacher and we are running up to A-level exams in the UK at the moment, so if the content on YouTube does take a little bit of a slowdown in the next couple of weeks, I'm very, very busy with that. It will get better, especially over the summer when I've got plenty of time. As always, thank you very much for listening. Look after yourselves till next week. My name's Ross, and you've been listening to PTCG Radio.